High in the Andes, where night temperatures plunge below freezing even in summer, survival depended on more than strength. It depended on the walls of the home itself. For centuries, Andean families lived in one of the harshest climates on Earth. The Puna winds cut like knives. Nights froze water solid in clay pots. Yet inside their humble houses, built of nothing but stone, straw, and earth, families stayed warm enough to endure the cold that killed livestock outside their doors. Their secret wasn't magic. It was engineering. Thick stone walls acted as thermal batteries, absorbing the sun's heat through the day and releasing it slowly through the night. Straw-packed roofs trapped precious warmth. Earthen floors radiated stored heat upward, and every detail, from the angle of the walls to the placement of the hearth, was crafted to turn the home into a passive, energy-saving survival machine long before modern science gave it a name. These homes weren't just shelters. They were life-preserving technologies, born from necessity, refined by tradition, and perfected over generations living at the edge of the world. How did Andean families engineer stone-straw hybrid homes that kept them alive through freezing mountain nights? Part 1. The air in the Altiplano at 4,000 meters above the sea was a different element. It was thin, sharp, and carried the crystalline light of Inti, the sun god, with an unfiltered intensity. But when Inti began his descent behind the snow-dusted peaks of the Cordillera Real in the autumn of 1450, that same air became a thief, stealing warmth with a silent, merciless efficiency. In the small, scattered community of Culana, a settlement of a few dozen families perched on the vast, wind-scoured plains near Lake Titicaca, the transition was a daily ritual of retreat and endurance. Their lives, governed by the agricultural calendar of the highlands, the planting of potatoes and quinoa, the herding of llamas and alpacas, were inextricably tied to the rhythms of the sun. The community, a small elu, functioned as a single extended family, sharing labor, food, and misfortune with a stoic sense of interdependence forged by the unforgiving environment. This collective strength was their greatest asset, but it was also a source of immense pressure to conform. To deviate was to risk not just social censure, but the disruption of a delicate balance that ensured their collective survival. It was a balance paid for in hardship, a pact with the land that demanded obedience above all else. This obedience was written in the lines on Yaku's face, and in the unquestioning way Amaru mended his tools. It was the silent, powerful force that Killa was now challenging. Inside a circular stone dwelling, a putuku, the air was thick with the smells of burning tola wood, llama stew, and the persistent, damp chill that even the fire could not banish. Killa, a woman of 25 whose name meant moon in the Quechua language, moved with a quiet grace that belied a restless, analytical mind. Her eyes, the color of dark obsidian, seemed to absorb the light around her, missing nothing. Her hands, calloused from the weaver's loom and the digging stick, were rarely still, constantly engaged in the productive, life-sustaining tasks that defined her existence. Weaving was not just a craft for Killa, it was a language, a way of thinking. She saw the world in terms of threads, of tension and structure, of how individual strands, weak on their own, could be interlaced to create something strong and resilient. She saw the warp and weft in the patterns of the wind on the lake, in the interlocking stones of a terrace, in the very fabric of her community. This unique perspective allowed her to see solutions where others saw only the immutable face of tradition. She saw the potential for a new kind of synthesis, a stronger fabric woven from both old and new threads. Her hands, calloused from the loom and the field, expertly worked a spindle, drawing a fine thread from a cloud of alpaca wool. Across the single smoky room, her husband, Amaru, mended a farming tool, his brow furrowed in concentration. Between them, huddled close to the central fire pit, their 5-year-old son, Inti, coughed. It was a small sound, a dry, rasping bark that was almost lost in the crackle of the flames, but to Killa's attuned ears, it was a thunderclap, a harbinger of the familiar, dreaded enemy. Every night, as the temperature outside plummeted to below freezing, the cough returned. The putuku, built in the tradition of their ancestors, stretching back to the time of the Tiwanaku Empire, whose enigmatic ruins lay scattered across the landscape, was a fortress of stone. Its walls, a single layer of field stones held together with mud mortar, were strong against the wind. But stone was a treacherous friend. It drank the cold of the night and held it deep within, radiating a damp, penetrating chill that no fire could fully defeat. The smoke from the open hearth, with no chimney to guide it, filled the space, a constant acrid presence that stung the eyes and coated the thatched roof with a layer of greasy black soot. Respiratory illness was a constant companion in the village, a shadow that clung to the young and the old. It was a choice between freezing in the pure, thin air or slowly choking in the smoky warmth. On the morning of April 12th, 1450, after a particularly cold night, Inti's cough had worsened. His small body was hot with fever. Killa, her heart a tight knot of fear, carried him to the home of Yaku, the village elder and curandero. Yaku, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles carved by 100 seasons, examined the boy. He listened to his breathing, his expression grim. He prepared a poultice of munya and other herbs, their pungent aroma filling his dark, cluttered home. "The herbs will fight the spirit of the cough," he said, his voice raspy. "But the true enemy is the chiri, the cold. It is a spirit that enters the bones. You must keep him warm." Killa's fear sharpened into a familiar, bitter anger. She had heard these words before. A decade earlier, during the unforgivingly harsh winter of 1440, her younger sister, Mayu, had been taken by the same illness. Mayu, a bright, laughing girl of 7, had faded over the course of a single, brutal month, her laughter replaced by a shallow, painful cough that echoed Killa's memory. The same cough, the same fever, the same losing battle against the cold that seeped through the stone walls of their home. The memory was a fresh wound. She remembered her mother's desperate prayers to the apus, the mountain spirits, the frantic piling of llama hides on her sister's shivering body, and the final, terrible silence. The curandero had blamed a malevolent spirit then too, a soka that had stolen the warmth from Mayu's lungs. But Killa, even as a girl of 15, had felt a deep intuitive skepticism. She had sat by her sister's side, feeling the deathly chill that radiated from the very walls of their home, a cold that seemed to mock the small sputtering fire. The stones, which were supposed to be their protection, felt like an enemy, a silent accomplice to the illness that was consuming her sister. They were a beautiful, durable tomb. It wasn't a spirit, she thought with a surge of defiant clarity. It was physics. It was the house. It was the relentless, seeping cold that the stones seemed to breathe into the room each night, a cold that was as real and as deadly as any predator that stalked the plains. That evening, as Amaru tried to comfort the whimpering Inti, Killa made a decision. "We cannot live like this," she said, her voice low but fierce. "The stone is killing us. The smoke is choking us. There has to be a better way." Amaru looked at her, his face etched with worry. "This is the way of our people, Killa. It is the way it has always been since the time of the first grandfathers. The stones are from the Pachamama. The design is a gift. A gift that takes our children? Killa retorted, her voice rising with a grief-fueled passion that startled Amaru. The Pachamama gives us the stone, yes, but she also gives us the ichu grass that blankets the hills, the clay in the riverbeds, the brilliant sun that warms our backs during the day. And she gives us minds to think. What if we used them differently? What if we built a house that holds the warmth of the sun instead of hoarding the cold of the night? Her words, spoken into the smoky air of their home, were a spark of rebellion. The next day, she approached Yaku as he sat in the sun, chewing a wad of coca leaves. She spoke of her idea of thicker walls, of a different kind of roof, of a way to guide the smoke out. Yaku listened, his eyes narrowing. When she finished, he spat a stream of green juice onto the dusty ground. "You speak blasphemy," he hissed. "You would change the ways of the ancestors? The ways that have kept us alive in this land for 1,000 years? Our homes are built in communion with the Apus. Their shape, their materials, they are a prayer in stone. To change them is to invite the anger of the spirits. You are a weaver, a woman. Stick to your loom. Do not meddle in the affairs of builders and the gods." His dismissal was absolute, his voice carrying the weight of unquestioned authority. The other villagers who had overheard murmured in agreement, their faces a mixture of ingrained fear and social disapproval. To question the elder was to question the foundations of their society. Killa stood alone, the wind whipping her black hair across her face, making her feel as isolated as a single stalk of ichu on a vast plain. She was an outcast in her own home, her desperate idea for survival branded as heresy. But as she looked towards the distant snow-capped peaks of Ilampu and Illimani, the great silent Apus that Yaku claimed to speak for, she felt not fear, but a defiant resolve. The spirits had not saved her sister. The traditions had not saved her son from this sickness. If she was to save him, she would have to find her own communion with the forces of the world, not through blind obedience, but through understanding. Part 2. Yaku's condemnation did not extinguish the fire in Killa's mind. It banked it, forcing it to burn hotter and more intensely. She began a period of quiet, obsessive observation, a secret apprenticeship to the world around her. Her days were spent in the fields with Amaru, her hands busy with the harvest of potatoes and quinoa, but her eyes were constantly scanning, analyzing, deconstructing the principles of warmth and shelter. She noted how the vizcachas, the furry chinchilla-like rodents of the high Andes, burrowed deep into the earth, their dens insulated by soil and rock. She watched the llamas and alpacas huddle together during the cold nights, their thick fleece a natural barrier, trapping their collective body heat. Her most profound classroom, however, was in the silent, windswept ruins that dotted the landscape, the skeletal remains of civilizations that had faced this same cold and, for a time, had thrived. These were not just piles of stone, they were libraries of forgotten knowledge, and Killa became their most devoted student. She would spend hours there, ignoring the chilling stories of the spirits of the ancients, the Gentiles, that were said to haunt such places. For Killa, the only spirits in those ruins were the spirits of ingenuity and forgotten wisdom, and she was determined to learn their language. The ghosts of the Tiwanaku were not threats, they were teachers. A half-day's walk from their village on a windswept hill lay the remnants of a small Tiwanaku settlement abandoned since the 12th century. While other villagers avoided the place, believing it to be haunted by the spirits of the Gentiles, the ancient ones, Killa was drawn to it. She spent hours there, tracing the lines of the stonework with her fingers. The Tiwanaku builders, she realized, were masters of a different kind of stonecraft, a more patient and precise art than the hurried work of her own people. Unlike the simple fieldstone and mud construction of her own village, these walls were made of large, precisely cut blocks, fitted together with a startling accuracy, even without mortar. This was the technique the Incas would later perfect, but its origins were here. The walls were also thicker, sometimes consisting of two parallel faces of stone with a rubble fill in between. It was a simple, powerful idea, a wall within a wall, a barrier of air. Killa didn't have the words for it, but she understood the principle in her bones. The cold could defeat one wall, but two, with a space for air to stagnate and slow the transfer of heat, might just be a worthy opponent. Her other great discovery came from her own craft. As a weaver, she understood insulation. She knew that a loosely woven blanket was useless against the cold, while a tightly woven one, like the awayu she used to carry inti on her back, was a formidable barrier. She began to experiment with the ichu grass, the ubiquitous, tough, golden yellow grass that covered the Altiplano. The traditional roofs in her village used a layer of ichu, but it was a relatively thin layer, quickly applied and often needing repair after the rainy season of the previous year, which had ended in March 1450. Killa gathered bundles of the grass, which grew in abundance in the highlands above 3,500 meters. Using a technique adapted from her weaving, she began to bundle and tie the grass into dense, tightly compressed sheaves. It was slow, laborious work, but the result was a mat of thatch, so thick and dense it was almost waterproof, and, she suspected, a powerful insulator. Slowly, over the course of the dry season, from June to September 1450, a radical concept formed in her mind. It was a synthesis of everything she had observed: the burrow of the Vizcacha, the fleece of the llama, the double-walled ruins of the Tiwanaku, and the dense weave of her own textiles. She envisioned a new kind of house, a hybrid. It would have low, thick walls, built like the Tiwanaku ruins with two faces of stone, creating an inner air gap to slow the transfer of cold. This technique, a cavity wall, was a revolutionary departure from the single-stone construction of her people. The house would be oriented to the east, to capture the first rays of the morning sun, and most importantly, it would be crowned with a massive, steeply pitched roof made of her densely woven ichu thatch, not a thin layer, but a thick, heavy cloak, perhaps a meter thick, that would sit on the stone walls like a warm hat. She chose a secluded spot, away from the judgmental eyes of the village, and began to build a small, child-sized prototype. Amaru, torn between his ingrained respect for tradition and his growing fear for their son, watched her with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He did not help, not at first, but he did not stop her either. He brought her food and water, his silent presence a fragile shield against the village's disapproval. The work was grueling. Killa had to haul the stones herself, her back and shoulders aching with a fiery protest. She learned to read the stones, to see their natural cleavage planes, using smaller, harder river cobbles as makeshift hammers to shape them, a primitive form of the percussion techniques used by master stonemasons. It was an education in geology and physics learned through sweat and strain, a stark contrast to the mystical explanations offered by Yaku. She was learning the language of the earth itself, not the stories told about it. And the earth, she was discovering, spoke of principles, not spirits. It spoke of mass and insulation, of angles and orientation, a practical gospel that offered a different kind of salvation. She used her knowledge of leverage, learned from watching builders move stones for community projects, to maneuver them into place. She built the double-faced wall, filling the gap between with smaller stones and soil, creating the thermal break she had envisioned. The most difficult part was the roof. She constructed a simple wooden frame of alder logs, angled more steeply than a traditional roof, knowing that a steeper pitch would shed the heavy rains of the wet season more effectively and bear a greater load of snow. Then she began to apply her dense ichu bundles, tying them to the frame with ropes of twisted grass, layering them one on top of the other in a thick, overlapping pattern that mimicked the scales of a fish. It was a technique that had more in common with building a giant, tightly woven basket than with traditional thatching. Her secret work did not go unnoticed. Yaku, hearing whispers of Killa's strange project, came to the site. He stood on the rise above her, his face a thundercloud of fury. "You defy the ancestors," he shouted, his voice echoing in the thin air. "You are building a monument to your own pride. The Apus see this. The Pachamama feels this wound you are making. You are inviting disaster upon us all." He accused her of disturbing the sacred order, of placing her own fleeting judgment above the time-tested wisdom of generations. He warned that her actions were a grave insult to the Pachamama, an act of hubris that would surely bring misfortune. His words were a poison, and some of the villagers began to shun Killa and Amaru openly, fearing the elders' prophecy of spiritual retribution. Part 3. By late October 1450, as the planting season was ending, the prototype was complete. It was a strange-looking structure, low and stout, more mound than house, its enormous thatched roof seeming to grow directly from the earth. It had a single, small, trapezoidal doorway, an Inca-influenced design Killa had adopted for its inherent stability. Just as she finished sealing the last of the stonework with a mixture of clay and ichu fibers, a change came to the weather. An unseasonable cold front, born in the vast, frozen expanses of the south, swept across the Altiplano. The sky turned a bruised purple, and a biting wind whipped across the plains, carrying the first stinging flakes of snow. The temperature plummeted. That night, the cold was not just a thief, it was an assassin. Inside the traditional putukus, families huddled around their fires, the stone walls weeping with condensation, the cold radiating from them like a physical presence. But in her small experimental shelter, Killa, with a nervous Amaru and a feverish Inti beside her, lit a tiny fire. The space was small, but the effect was immediate and profound. The thick woven roof did not leak smoke. Instead, the smoke found its way out through a small, carefully designed vent at the peak, a feature Killa had devised after many sleepless nights. The double stone walls, a feature inspired by the ancient Tiwanaku, performed their function perfectly. The outer wall bore the brunt of the freezing air, but the inner air gap acted as a buffer, a space of trapped, non-moving air that refused to conduct the cold. The inner wall, shielded from the direct cold, absorbed the heat from the fire in their bodies, becoming a gentle radiator of warmth. It didn't radiate cold. It held a neutral, almost welcoming temperature. It was a concept modern engineers would call thermal mass and a thermal break working in harmony. The house was breathing, inhaling the warmth of the fire and exhaling it slowly through the night. It was a living thing, a partner in survival, not a cold stone adversary. For the first time, Killa felt she was living in a home that was on her side, a shelter that actively fought for her family's life. The thick ichu roof, a meter of compressed grass, was a silent, powerful shield against the wind and the freezing air. Killa spent the night awake, her hand resting on Inti's chest. For the first time in weeks, his breathing was even, the terrible, rasping cough subdued. He slept soundly, wrapped in the gentle, smoke-free warmth of the small space. Amaru, who had entered the structure a skeptic, sat in stunned silence, feeling the impossible warmth, breathing the clean air. He looked at Killa, his eyes shining in the firelight with a look of pure reverence. The tradition of 1,000 years had been broken, and his son was breathing easier for it. By morning, Inti's fever had broken. The success was undeniable, a miracle woven from grass and stone. Word of the warm, smoke-free house and Inti's sudden recovery spread through the village like wildfire, a story whispered in the fields and by the river. A few other young families, their own children suffering from the constant cold, came to see it. They felt the warmth, saw the healthy flush on Inti's cheeks, and their skepticism began to melt away. Killa's heresy was beginning to look like wisdom. This shift in allegiance was a direct challenge to Yaku's authority, and he could not abide it. He saw Killa's success not as a blessing, but as a dangerous subversion of the natural order. "You have tricked a minor spirit of the earth," he proclaimed in the village center, his voice trembling with rage. "But the great Apus, the lords of the mountains, are not so easily fooled. They see your arrogance. They will answer this defiance with a demonstration of their true power." As if on cue, on the first day of November 1450, the earth trembled. A seismic tremor, not uncommon in the Andes, rolled through the region. It was not a violent quake, but it was strong enough to shake the foundations of the village. A few stones were dislodged from the older putukus. The roof of Yaku's own home, a symbol of his status, shifted, and a section of the mud and stone wall cracked. But Killa's prototype, with its low profile, stable trapezoidal door, and interlocking stonework, was completely unharmed. To Killa's growing number of supporters, it was further proof of the superiority of her design. To Yaku and his staunch followers, however, it was a clear and ominous warning from the Apus, a sign of their growing displeasure with the village's departure from tradition. The tension in the village became a palpable thing, as thick as the morning fog that rolled off the lake. The final omen arrived a week later, carried by a traveling merchant, a man who traded salt and coca leaves across the high plains. He spoke of a strange stillness in the air, of unusual cloud formations high in the Cordillera, and of the strange, agitated behavior of the vicuñas. He spoke of the legend of the Yurak Waira, the White Wind, a catastrophic blizzard that, according to the old stories, swept the Altiplano once every 100 years, a storm powerful enough to bury villages and wipe out entire herds. The last one, the stories said, had been in the time of their great-grandfathers, around 1350, a storm that had reshaped the very landscape. "The signs," the merchant whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement, were all there. The White Wind was coming. Part 4. The merchant's prophecy of the White Wind ignited a fire of panic in the community. The oldest members of the village, who had heard the tales from their own grandparents, confirmed the signs. The unnatural calm, the ring around the moon, the way the llamas refused to graze in the high pastures, it all pointed to the coming of the great storm. Yaku seized upon the fear, his voice a clarion of doom. "It is the punishment," he declared, his arms raised to the sky. "The Apus are angered by this defiance of the sacred ways. The White Wind comes to cleanse the land of this arrogant newness." But for Killa, the prophecy was not a death sentence. It was a deadline. She, Amaru, and the handful of families who now believed in her vision began to work with a desperate, feverish energy. They were no longer building a prototype, they were building an ark. They chose the site of Killa's small shelter and began to expand it, tearing down the original structure to build a larger, communal-sized hybrid house. They worked day and night under the cold, watchful eye of the moon. The men, led by Amaru, hauled and placed the stones, building the thick, double-faced walls that Killa had designed. The women, under Killa's direction, gathered and wove the ichu grass, creating hundreds of the dense, insulating bundles for the massive roof. On the third day of their frantic construction, in mid-November 1450, the sky began to change. The brilliant blue of the Altiplano sky was slowly veiled by a high, thin layer of white, a milky haze that bled the color from the world. The wind died completely, and an eerie, profound silence fell over the landscape. The temperature began to drop, not with the usual swiftness of the coming night, but with a steady, inexorable decline. The white wind was no longer a prophecy. It was a presence, gathering its strength in the frozen peaks. The blizzard struck at dusk. It did not arrive with a roar, but with a whisper. A few flakes of snow, then a gentle curtain, and then the world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The wind came alive, a solid, screaming force that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. It was a wind unlike any they had ever known, a horizontal blizzard that erased the line between earth and sky. The temperature plunged to 20 degrees C, then 25 degrees C, a cold that felt like a physical blow. The traditional putukus, with their single-layer walls and relatively light roofs, were no match for this onslaught. The wind, a force of nature that seemed to have a malevolent intelligence, screamed like a hungry predator. It found purchase under the shallow eaves of the thin thatched roofs, lifting them, worrying them, and then tearing them away in great shredded chunks. The interiors were instantly exposed to the full, blinding fury of the storm, the temperature inside dropping to fatal levels in minutes. The roar of the wind was punctuated by the terrified screams of families as their world was torn apart. It was the sound of a tradition, a way of life that had endured for a millennium, being violently dismantled in a matter of hours. The white wind was not just a storm. It was a brutal, unforgiving audit of their way of life. It was a test of not just their structures, but of their beliefs, their leadership, and their ability to adapt or perish. The single-layer stone walls, now super-chilled by the wind, became conduits of cold, sucking the life and warmth from the rooms. Families huddled in terror as their homes, the shelters that had protected their ancestors for centuries, disintegrated around them. The roof of Yaku's own home was one of the first to go, torn away with a violent shriek, leaving his family exposed and shivering in the swirling snow. In the heart of the storm, Killa's new house stood firm. Its low profile offered little for the wind to grab. The massive, meter-thick ichu roof, heavy and dense, absorbed the force of the gale, its tightly woven structure refusing to yield. Inside, it was crowded, chaotic, and blessedly warm. Killa, Amaru, and the other families had taken refuge there just as the storm hit. The interior was lit by a single, small fire, its heat radiating through the room. The thick stone walls, protected from the wind by the deep eaves of the roof, slowly released the warmth they had absorbed from the sun and the fire, creating a stable, livable environment. As the storm raged, a desperate cry was heard over the howl of the wind. It was one of Yaku's children. Amaru, his face set, tied a rope around his waist and, handing the other end to Killa, plunged into the white chaos. He returned minutes later, half carrying a frost-bitten and terrified Yaku, followed by his shivering wife and children. They stumbled into the warmth of the hybrid house, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock, fear, and dawning comprehension. Yaku, the proud traditionalist, the voice of the ancestors, collapsed onto the warm floor, his authority stripped away by the very force he had claimed to command. He was just a man, a cold and frightened man, saved by the very innovation he had condemned. Throughout the long, terrible night, Killa and Amaru led rescue efforts, bringing the remaining villagers, family by family, into the sanctuary of their new home. The house, designed for one family, now held the entire community. It was cramped, the air thick with the steam of wet clothes and the smell of fear, but it was a haven of life in a world of white death. The stone-straw hybrid home, born from a mother's love and a weaver's wisdom, had faced the ultimate test. It had withstood not just the wind, but the soul-stealing cold, and had triumphed, becoming a beacon of hope in a world of white despair. Part 5. The white wind raged for 2 full days. When it finally subsided on the morning of November 18, 1450, it revealed a world transformed, a landscape scoured and buried under a deep blanket of white. The sun, when it returned, seemed pale and distant, its light glinting off a silent, frozen world. From the warm sanctuary of the hybrid house, the villagers emerged, one by one, into the devastating aftermath. Their former homes were gone, reduced to broken circles of stone and scattered frozen debris. Their herds of llamas and alpacas, caught in the open, were lost, buried in the snow. The village of Kulana, as they had known it, had been erased. But they were alive. Every man, woman, and child who had taken refuge in Killa's house had survived. In the face of their shared loss, a new spirit began to emerge, one not of despair, but of profound, humbled gratitude. The first to give voice to this new spirit was Yaku. He gathered the survivors in front of the house that had saved them. His face was gaunt, his eyes stripped of their old arrogance. He looked at Killa, not as a defiant upstart, but as a leader. "I spoke of the anger of the Apus," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But I was wrong. I was blind. The Apus did not send the white wind to punish us. They sent it to teach us that tradition is not a cage, but a foundation upon which we must build." Killa did not defy the ancestors. She honored them by listening to the Pachamama in a way that I had forgotten. She has saved us. Her wisdom will now be our tradition. He bowed his head to her, a gesture of submission and respect that sent a ripple of astonishment through the crowd. The rebuilding of Kulana began not with stones, but with a shared purpose, a collective understanding born from shared trauma and shared salvation. Killa's design, the stone-straw hybrid, became the blueprint for their new community, a symbol of their resilience. The knowledge that had been hers alone was now shared, taught, and refined. Yaku, with his deep knowledge of the land, helped locate the best sources of stone. Amaru organized the labor, and Killa, the architect of their survival, oversaw the construction, her voice now carrying the quiet authority of proven wisdom. They built not just houses, but a new kind of community, one forged in the crucible of the storm, balancing the ancient respect for the land with a newfound courage to innovate. In the spring of 1451, as the last of the snows melted, a visitor arrived in the village. It was Pachacuti, a master stonemason in the service of the Inca emperor, Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, who was in the midst of his great imperial expansion. The stonemason was traveling the region, surveying resources and recruiting skilled labor for the massive building projects in Cusco. He had heard tales of a village that had survived the white wind, and he came to see for himself. He was astounded by what he found. He saw the elegant efficiency of the hybrid design, the brilliant synthesis of thermal mass and insulation. He was particularly impressed with Killa's intuitive grasp of structural principles and her deep understanding of the thermal properties of local materials. He saw that her knowledge was not theoretical, but empirical, born from thousands of hours of observation and hands-on work. It was a form of engineering knowledge that was not written on knotted quipus, but was woven into the very fabric of her craft, as intricate and as strong as the textiles she created. He recognized in her a fellow master builder, albeit one whose medium was not just stone, but the entire environment. He saw that she built not just with materials, but with principles, with the sun, the wind, and the cold itself. He returned to Cusco with tales of the weaver architect of Culana, and her story became a quiet legend among the empire's engineers. It served as a reminder that true imperial strength lay not just in grand temples and military might, but in the resilience and adaptability of its people, and that wisdom could be found in the most unexpected of places, and that the greatest innovations often come from those closest to the problem. He spent a month in the village, not as a superior, but as a collaborator. He shared with Killa the advanced Inca techniques of polygonal masonry, the art of fitting stones so perfectly that a knife blade could not pass between them. In return, Killa shared her knowledge of thermal dynamics, of how to build a house that breathed with the sun and held its warmth against the night. The local grassroots innovation was now cross-pollinating with the sophisticated engineering of the empire. Final scene, autumn, 1470. 20 years later. The village of Culana is thriving. The houses, a beautiful and uniform collection of stone-straw hybrids, are clustered together, their golden roofs glowing in the late afternoon sun. The fields are green with a healthy crop of quinoa, and large herds of llamas and alpacas graze on the hillsides. It is a picture of resilience and prosperity, a community that has not just survived, but has adapted and thrived. Inside one of the homes, a group of children are gathered around a woman. It is Killa, her hair now streaked with silver, her face serene and wise. She is using small stones and bundles of grass to demonstrate a principle of construction to the children, among them her own son, Inti, now a strong, healthy young man. "The stone is the memory of the house," she explains, her voice gentle. "It remembers the sun's warmth long after the sun is gone. The ichu is the blanket. It holds that warmth close and does not let the cold of the night steal it away. One without the other is weak. Together," she says, placing a thick bundle of grass atop a circle of stones, "they are strong. They are a home." Inti smiles, his hand resting on the warm stone wall of their house. He looks at his mother, his eyes filled with love and admiration. The camera pulls back, out of the small trapezoidal door, showing the warm, vibrant life within. It continues to pull back, rising high above the village, showing the collection of hybrid homes nestled into the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving landscape of the Altiplano. They are no longer just shelters. They are a testament, a living legacy of the woman who listened to the whispers of the earth, defied a rigid tradition, and taught her people how to weave a blanket of warmth against the cold breath of the gods. They are a prayer not just of stone, but of stone and straw, of tradition and innovation, of a mother's fierce love, and of the enduring, unbreakable spirit of survival. They are the quiet, powerful legacy of the moon weaver who taught her people how to build a home that could hold the sun. They are the testament to the idea that the most profound innovations are often born not from a desire for glory, but from the simple, fierce, and unwavering love of a mother for her child. A love that could look at a mountain of stone and see not an obstacle, but a foundation. A love that could take the humblest of materials, the grass of the plains, the stones of the field, and weave them into a future.